Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm super excited to be in this conference, not just to present, but also kind of in awe of all the other speakers who are presenting here, such as Izzy just before me. That was a great talk on Web Vitals, something that's very relevant to my day-to-day struggles as well. But I'm going to talk about something quite different, and we're talking about marketing data collection in my talk, and the topic of server-side tagging, of server-side tracking as well, if you will, and other kind of new ways or new paradigms of collecting data for marketing and analytics purposes. And I've intentionally left a bit of an ellipsis in the title, so there are many folks out there talking about the future of data collection, and the future of data collection being in the server side or in the server itself. So let's see what what this means. Just very briefly about myself, I'm partner and co-founder of two companies, 8BitCheap and Simmer. 8BitCheap is a digital services boutique or a digital services company. We offer consultation and all things data. We are developers first and foremost, but we are all kind of fanatic about data. And Simmer is an online course platform I co-founded with my wife and business partner during the pandemic. And one of the courses we have is on server-side tagging. So I'll leave that to the end with some resources. If any of the things I talk about today ring true, be sure to check out my blog on simoahava.com, where I have extensively written about server-side tagging, among other things. So to get started, before we jump into server-side tagging, I want to talk about what we are working against. What is the point of reference for server-side tagging, and this idea of what is tagging in general? Well, tagging in its all simplicity means the action of adding vendors and adding vendor JavaScript on the site and sending information to these vendors through the script whenever a conversion event happens, for example. So say you have a website and you want to measure the effectiveness of your advertising campaigns, or you want to measure the effectiveness of how your content is producing conversions. And when your users subscribe to a newsletter or make a purchase, you want to inform vendors such as Facebook or Google Analytics or Google Ads that a conversion happened, because that's how you know your advertisements have been effective and your campaigns are being effective. And this is typically done with a tag manager. So a tag manager is added on the site, and it's kind of a wrapper for all these vendor JavaScripts. And you configure those tags, and you configure them to fire upon the conversion event and send the metadata to the vendors. So this is the kind of regular way of doing marketing tagging. The problem with this approach is mainly that it requires a direct communication channel between the user's browser and then the vendor server. So the browser is sending these HTTP requests to the vendor, and then the vendor responds back from their server directly to the browser. And allowing this sort of bilateral communication between the vendor and the browser kind of leads to some collateral damage, if you will. First of all, when you want to send something to Facebook or to Google Analytics, the browser first needs to download a library that handles this communication, that handles the building of these conversion events. And this is loaded from the vendor's CDN or content distribution network, or it could be loaded from some other place, such as a more common or generic CDN, such as JS Deliver or Unpack, UnPKG or something like that. But regardless, the browser needs to download this library from a third-party resource. And this means that the site doing this needs to allow communications with this third-party resource in their content security policy. And the user's firewall needs to allow for these requests. And even then, the CDN might be super slow, resulting in degraded performance on the site itself. Hey, actually, this does relate to Izzy's talk. So we are talking about performance here today as well. The other implication is that whenever the browser is communicating with a vendor server, any cookies set on those vendor domains will be included in the requests, assuming the browser doesn't block third-party cookies. And obviously, most browsers now do block them, but the market leader, Google Chrome, doesn't. So third-party cookies are still very much a thing. And third-party cookies are activated only by virtue of communicating directly with the server or the site on which the cookies are set. So when your browser is sending a request to analytics.google.com, any cookies written on google.com will be included in that request. And that way Google could theoretically build more extensive identity graphs, even though you are only sending data to Google Analytics. And even without third-party cookies, these vendors are running their JavaScript on the page on the page running in the user's browser, so they can use first-party cookies as well as much as they like. They can pull in all information from your cookies and other browser storage and collect it on their servers, even if it's completely unrelated to the vendor itself. So they do pose kind of a potential security risk, but definitely a privacy risk. And many times these third-party cookies and even first-party data storage is being used for cross-site tracking. And this is kind of the cross-site tracking is kind of the big hoopla that Apple started tackling in 2017 with their intelligent tracking prevention. So the whole point of these tracking prevention mechanisms is to eliminate cross-site tracking. They're not that interested or involved with same-site tracking or first-party analytics. They're worried that vendors are collecting information from users across websites, building navigational behavior graphs based on the user's visits to other sites than the one the user or the site itself is interested in. So this kind of leads to, well, there's been a lot of literature about what cross-site tracking can lead to, such as building political news bubbles and creating advertisement that isn't flattering or is too revealing or just has too much information that the user can't actually impact. And there are a couple of other things here, such as just cross-site scripting attacks and PII leaks. These are kind of more edge cases, perhaps, but cross-site scripting attacks only work if the browser is communicating with a third-party vendor. That's how a cross-site scripting attack works. They typically hijack a domain which poses as the kind of, for example, instead of google-analytics.com, they've hijacked googleanalytics.com without the dash. And then that domain is being used for some kind of a man-in-the-middle attack, providing these cross-site scripting scripts that are then causing havoc, stealing credentials and stuff like that. Again, this is only enabled by the browser communicating directly with the vendors. And then a very common thing, I think, for most people who have been using Google Analytics is this idea of a PII leak. So personally identifiable information and other personal data, for example, embedded in the URL of the page, a very common use case, can leak to these third-party vendors because they almost always collect the URL. And when you are sending personal data to third-party vendors, you are in big trouble, especially in the European Union, where GDPR has very clear and very unambiguous provisions for processing and collecting personal data without a legal basis. And these vendors most certainly don't have that when you're accidentally sending that information forward. So just to reiterate, this is describing the situation without kind of server-side tagging. This is what the problem of regular tagging is. Whenever you install a Google Analytics tracker or a Google Ads conversion tracker or a Facebook tracker, you are subjecting the user's browser to potential misuse and harm through these vectors, among other things. I'm not saying that tagging itself is a bad thing always, but these are very serious things that you should account for. Now, to kind of solve many of these issues, there is the concept of server-side tagging, which is very similar to what we're doing here, in that you still have a website and you still have vendors that need to know when a conversion happened. But instead of the browser communicating directly with these vendors, there's an intermediary piece of technology between the browser and the vendors. And this is in Google Tag Manager's terminology, this is a server container. It's a kind of a staging area for data owned by the company running the website. So it's part of the first party kind of sphere of data collection between the site and then the server container itself. And the browser only communicates with this resource. So whenever a conversion event happens, instead of sending it to Facebook and to Google Analytics and to Google Ads, the conversion event is sent to this server-side proxy, running typically on a subdomain of the site itself. And what this enables is you get to kind of validate the data stream in real time. So even before the vendor receives the data, you get to do transformations to it. For example, clear it of all identifiers that the user hasn't consented to, or for example, if it's a Google Analytics event missing some kind of a key label, you can dynamically add it to it in case it's missing. So you can do this kind of hit validation, hit enrichment stuff before it is then forwarded to the vendors. A very, very valuable tool, because so many times, as we all know, it's easy to tag things incorrectly, which then leads to kind of a hindsight 2020 situation where you're wondering, if I only had the tools to kind of nip this problem in the bud. With the server container, you certainly do have that. A very key part of server-side tagging is this idea of stream consolidation. So if you take a look at this image more carefully, you can see that instead of the browser sending a request to Facebook and to Google Analytics and to Google Ads, so 3 separate requests, the browser is only sending a single request to the server container. And the reason for this is that when you think about a conversion event, let's take a purchase, for example, all the vendors, Facebook, Google Ads, Google Analytics, they all want the same information, or pretty much the same information. They want to know that a purchase event happened. They want to know what the total value of that event was. And sometimes they want an identifier for the order, for example, and maybe some other metadata. But the semantic content of these requests is remarkably similar always. So why have the browser go through the redundant actions of sending the same bit of information to three different endpoints, when instead you can kind of send a vendor agnostic blob of data to the server container, where it's then mapped to the format that Facebook requires, mapped to the format that Google Analytics requires, and mapped to the format that Google Ads requires. So you're saving bandwidth in the browser, you're normalizing the data, you're making sure that all vendors receive identical bits of information, so you don't have to kind of ETL it later. Only with a server-side proxy can you really achieve true anonymization. Now, I know that there's a feature in Google Analytics called Anonymize IP, for example, which is a flag where Google promises to ignore the last octet of the IP address when it receives it. So by removing the last octet, it removes the ability to pinpoint a single internet machine with the IP address, unless a single machine has somehow occupied a full range of IP addresses, or there's just a single address in that range. But that's not here nor there. But the point is that the IP address is still sent with the HTTP headers. So even if Google won't use it for analytics purposes, their servers have still collected that IP address, and the gateways where the request passes through have collected those IP addresses. And anything in between has collected those IP addresses. But with a server container, the only party that receives the IP address is the server container owned by the site itself, and if there are any proxies or edge networks between. But the point is that the vendors will never have access to the user's full IP address or even the anonymous IP address unless the server container manually decides to forward it. So this is a great way to get full anonymization by not actually passing the user's IP address or any other type of anonymizing or personalizing information, such as user agent strings or other identifiers. You can actually move consent management logic to the server. So instead of having the browser do all the determination, instead of having to do a complicated conditional setup in the browser where you need to check for what the CMP is saying, what the consent management platform is stating, what the consent status of the user is, and then kind of conditionally fire tags. You can instead just send this single data stream to the server, and as long as the consent settings are stored in a first-party cookie, for example, they will be included in the request. And then in the server container, you can then determine what to do with that information. And you can kind of, instead of just blocking an entire hit, you can actually just strip all the personal data away from those requests, anonymize them completely, and that way kind of preserve consent respect while still collecting some useful data, depending on what your region's legal stipulations state. Client-side performance gains just by stream consolidation are clear. By removing third-party JavaScript downloads, the browser has to do less work just to render the page. But you can go even further. You can load all your resources from your first-party domain through the server container. You can add custom caching to them. You can do very strong caches as well, such as 24-hour caches for any resource without having to download them from the third-party vendor servers. It requires a bit more work, and the absolute gains of server-side tagging versus regular tagging might not be apparent unless the site has like hundreds and hundreds of tags running. But small streams, folks. So taking baby steps with these things, anything you can reduce, all third-party communications you can reduce from the site will be a net benefit to performance. And then server-side tagging has this idea of tracking protection. So, for example, against intelligent tracking prevention, one of the key parts of ITP is that it reduces the lifetime of first-party cookies set with JavaScript. So whenever you have a vendor like Facebook or Google Analytics running on the site, they set their cookies with JavaScript, and these cookies have a maximum lifetime of 7 days on the Safari browser, and even just 24 hours in some cases. But when you set those cookies from server responses, ITP technically isn't interested in them anymore, and it allows their lifetime to be the full 2 years or whatever you like. So server-side tagging gives you additional tools for means and methods of preventing tracking by browsers and extensions. So let's talk about some of the reasons why you might want to jump on the server-side tagging bandwagon and why it might be a useful investment for your company. The first is this idea of ownership. You own the server container. It's not running on Google Tag Manager servers. It's running on Google Analytics servers. It's completely independent from them. It communicates with Google Tag Manager. It communicates with Google Analytics if you create those tags. But the server infra and the data the server container itself collects is completely owned by you. Here is the default implementation is Google Cloud Platform. And this is kind of a screenshot of their promises for data ownership. But even if you don't trust Google Cloud, you can install the server-side tagging technology on AWS. You can install it on Azure. You can install it on-premise if you want like full control, because it runs on a technology called Docker, which is kind of a portable infrastructure container system. So it can run on any cloud infra or any server infra that supports Docker containers, and those are kind of very, very common these days. By reducing third-party JavaScript or by removing the need for third-party JavaScript, you should be able to get performance gains, simply because the browser no longer has to pull in third-party libraries from third-party CDNs. So the browser doesn't have to go through the effort of downloading libraries, which essentially just do the same thing with just a bit different semantic payload and with just a bit different vendor endpoints. So consolidating those event stream lets you kind of save the browser from having to do a lot of extra work and just relaying the same information to multiple endpoints. And this will obviously help with content security policies as well. For those who don't know, CSPs are a way for the website itself to determine which domains and which host names and which origins and which URLs the browser is allowed to communicate with. So if the site is using a content security policy, and you want to download the Google Analytics library or send something to Google Analytics, then the Google Analytics URLs need to be explicitly stated in the content security policy, kind of telling the browser that it's okay to communicate with these. If the URL is not in the CSP, it means that the browser is not allowed to send any data there, and there will be an error shown in the console when this happens. The problem with the CSP is that every single domain you add to it makes it weaker. So the perfect CSP is one without a single cross-origin or a cross-site origin. But of course, we need to use third-party vendors, so we need to have a CSP with those exemptions. But with server-side tagging, you can reduce the number of third-party domains that you add to the CSP. For enrichment, you have the pull, power, and scale of the cloud platform. You no longer have to worry about browser resources or asynchronous race conditions when you wait for some API calls to complete. You can do all of this enrichment server-side, pulling in data from third-party APIs or first-party APIs, adding that information to those streams, and then sending it to the vendor. So kind of a typical use case I often use as an example is technically you could, when an e-commerce event happens, for example, all you need to do is send the order ID to the server container. And then in the server container, you pull whatever CRM or sales engine the company uses with that order ID, pull in the rest of the metadata about the order, what products were purchased, what revenue, and so on, and then send it to the vendors. So you don't have to implement this in the front end at all. You don't have to query these things in the front end, but you can do everything in the server. And as I mentioned, you can utilize the full scale of the HTTP protocol. So in addition to writing cookies in those responses to kind of help work with intelligent tracking prevention, you can also proxy third-party libraries to be sent from your own server endpoint. So again, instead of downloading, analytics.js, which is the Google Analytics library, instead of having the browser downloaded from googleanalytics.com, you can instead have the browser downloaded from myservercontainer.com. And then the container will fetch it from googleanalytics.com. And this will let you add custom cache headers. It will help with your CSP because the content security policy doesn't need to have googleanalytics.com out there. So then, why not? Why not go to server-side tag? What are the big pain points with server-side tagging? Because I'm obviously painting it as a very positive thing thus far. Now, some might see this as a positive, but I have taken a very strong personal and ethical stance that this is certainly not a positive thing to solve server-side tagging with. But by virtue of moving resource loads and proxying things from your own server container, you are able to circumvent ad and content blockers. So in this screenshot, for example, googleanalytics.com is blocked by most privacy blockers, such as Easy Privacy, Disconnect Me, and others. But simoahava.com isn't, at least until they see this presentation, and then they'll start blocking that as well. But this means that by moving these resource loads to my server container, the browser will be able to download them because the blockers are not interested in simoahava.com. Blockers are typically relying on a very simple heuristic of checking for domain name pattern matches. Sometimes they have other parts of the request URI as well, such as the path or the library name, but they almost always include just the domain name. And so by moving things to your own domain, you are able to circumvent ad blockers. I do not think this is a good thing. I think this is an unfortunate side effect of how server-side tagging works. I think if a user wants to block a resource, it is their privilege and their right to block that resource without you kind of forcing the browser to proxy it from your own server. But there's another aspect to this. Instead of just blocking the resource, you are also moving data collection to the server. So data processing happens behind the veil of the server, and anything that happens in the server stays on the server. So the Vegas rule applies here. It's impossible from a browser to know what happens to your data when it's collected to the server. So in this screenshot, for example, again, I'm sending a Google Analytics request to my server container. But in the server container, I could send that request forward to Facebook, to Criteo, to Adform. I could send it into a dozen different places, and the user has no idea this is happening. All they see is a Google Analytics type request being sent to the server container or to this custom server domain. So this is a huge problem because this reduces transparency and it makes the server setup less optimal than a client-side setup, because in a client-side setup, you can always verify what requests the browser is sending. And this is kind of an unsolved problem for now because the streams to the server are very unilateral. There's no responses back from the server telling what happened with that data. And even if there were, you wouldn't necessarily have to believe those because the server can be configured to respond whatever it likes back to the browser. For some, cost is obviously a factor. If you use the default provisioning method of server-side tagging or server-side containers, it will cost you around 110, 120 euros or 130, 140 USD per month. And that's using a technology called App Engine running on the Google Cloud Platform. So that's the default implementation. The recommended setup is 3 App Engine instances, and each of those are around 40 USD per month. So that's how you get to 120 USD a month. You could scale up or down to your liking. Like if you are with those 3 instances, you can comfortably collect dozens of millions of requests per month. So if you have a website which only needs to collect and process maybe 100,000 requests a month, you can obviously scale down to 2 instances, maybe even to 1 instance, although I don't think you'll ever want to have just a single instance in case of resource unavailability. So you won't have kind of a backup. But 2 instances will already shave 40 USD off your monthly cost. But even if you're not happy with this pricing, you can try other technologies. Cloud Run on Google Cloud Platform will probably get you to scale down your costs, especially if you have smaller traffic loads. You can move to AWS or Azure and see what their competitive pricing is. With Elastic Beanstalk, for example, you might get better prices than with App Engine. So a very big part of kind of cloud technologies is this idea of optimizing for computation, optimizing for network traffic, and then optimizing for cost. And it's totally possible to do, but with the default implementation, you're paying around 110, 120 euros per month. Now, for some companies, this is insurmountable. It's a huge cost, and they won't be jumping on the bandwagon because of that. But personally and anecdotally, I do think that it is a very fair price to pay, considering everything you get in return for doing so. A very real problem currently with server-side tagging is just the poor availability of server-to-server endpoints. So if you want your server-side container to send data to a vendor, the vendor has to support the type of communication that the server is doing. And although all the big ones already do, Google, Facebook, Amazon, LinkedIn, they all support server-to-server calls. There's a long tail of smaller vendors that don't, or that haven't published a public API for sending this information to. So part of the migration plan is to kind of take a look at which vendors actually support server-to-server calls, and then maybe petition the ones that don't to do something about it. And then the kind of final point, which is, both good and bad, is that third-party cookies won't work. So if you are using a vendor that relies on third-party cookies, then obviously they'll need to change their infra or their approach to make server-side tagging work for them, because the server container runs on your own domain rather than the vendor domain. So the vendor's cookies, the cookies written on the vendor domain, are not included in those requests. Some companies have, such as Facebook and Google, have introduced these things called enhanced conversions, where instead of relying on third-party cookies, you instead send some other first-party identifier, such as a hashed email address, to the vendor, and they're able to kind of build that graph without third-party cookies. But all of those solutions are very problematic, and you should be very cautious before jumping at the chance to install those. Before going to the Q&A, I want to kind of preemptively tackle some of the most frequently asked questions. One thing that's always kind of floating to the top is, does this replace client-side tagging? So is this something you would install in lieu of Google Tag Manager on the web? Well, no, this is a complementary approach. So it's running on the server. So it has no privilege to what happens in the web browser or the client unless the client communicates that to the server. So in this means that for example, if you want to know if a user scrolled or clicked something or subscribed to a newsletter, you have to have a script running on the site informing the server that this happened. And typically that script would be your web Google Tag Manager, because that's the easiest way to kind of measure those things. So this doesn't replace client-side tagging. It's a complementary thing running on the server. Think of it more like a proxy that the client-side tagger sends the information to instead of directly to the vendors. Terminological confusion, but this is not server-side tracking. Server-side tracking refers to the act of a server collecting data for tracking purposes, or data that lies in the server being sent forward to other servers. So for example, if you want to parse server logs and send that information to Facebook or Google, that would be server-side tracking. But this is, again, a proxy running on the server, and it can digest information from the server. So you can just as well send data to it from the server. So for example, if you're using measurement protocol in Google Analytics, you can point that measurement protocol request to the server container instead of to Google servers. And in the server container, you process and validate and enrich and block and check for consent or whatever else for that measurement protocol request before forwarding it to Google. But this isn't, server-side tagging itself isn't the mechanism that does this parsing. It's just a proxy. Legality is often questioned, so there's nothing inherently legal or inherently illegal about server-side tagging. In many ways, server-side tagging will help you be more compliant because it gives you full control over consent signals and clearing personal data from the requests and things like that. But also the opacity problem that I talked about, so the fact that things happen behind the veil of the server, that makes it also problematic from a legal point of view because the client doesn't have sufficient means of auditing that their data processing requests are being respected. So it's as legal as you make it. It certainly has tools and bells and whistles to make doing illegal stuff or to make doing nefarious stuff much easier because it all happens behind the curtain of the server. But it also have the same tools can be used to actually enhance things from a legal point of view. Is it future-proofed against ad blockers and tracking protections? Well, no, I don't think anything these days is future-proofed against these things, but it certainly has all the technologies that you need today in 2021 to be able to collect all the data you need without compromising the user's privacy. And then a very typical scenario these days, so some vendor wants you to start using their server-side API. So they send you emails saying that, hey, by the way, we have this new thing called Conversions API, or we have this new thing called server-side conversions. Please start doing it so that we can collect better data. And now the question is, should you comply with that? Should you set it up in your server-side tagging system? Well, I hate to be a pessimist, but typically these vendors don't have your best interests at heart, and they might not understand the nuances of regional legislation. So I would always do a very careful risk assessment of these vendor requests, because they often do this not because of privacy reasons, but because they want to collect data that would otherwise be blocked by the browser or maybe app tracking transparency framework in the latest iOS versions. So I would take all vendors' requests to help you get better data with a huge heap of salt, and be very careful if you want to comply with them. You will get these slides, so I'll just share this last slide here and you'll be able to take a closer look. I do recommend you take a look at the last link. So if server-side tagging is something that is interesting to your organization, take a look at our online course on the Simmer platform, and you can enroll. It's a self-paced course teaching you all you need to know about server-side tagging. Thank you so much for sticking with me to the end, and I hope to see some of your good questions next.
Simo, hi, thank you so much. It was great. It was a great presentation, very helpful tips. And I would like to, there was a question. Gökçe, thanks to you, says thanks for the great presentation. And there is another comment from Fabrice. Thank you for Mr. God for analytics. Do you think we should start implement server-side right now on important clients or too soon?
Well, that's a very good question, and always a very valid question to ask. I am not going to give you an answer that will satisfy you, because it's not my place to tell you the answer to that. It's not an obligatory technology. I think that's a very important part of it. This is kind of part of the answer why it doesn't replace client-side tagging, is that it's not something that everybody absolutely has to deploy right now or ever. It's a very useful bit of technology that addresses a very certain number of needs. But for example, if you are only collecting to Google Analytics, if you have very kind of low threshold of data collection needs, and you don't have a huge budget, let's say of a couple of €1,000 per year, might not be huge, but if you don't have that budget to begin with, then obviously no, you don't have to do it. However, there is a free tier. There is a free tier of server-side tagging using App Engine Standard, which is technically zero cost. It's not suitable for production traffic, but you can use it for a subset of your traffic to kind of try things around. And I do recommend, if you have the time, if you have a couple of days of time, do implement it and add Google Analytics tracking and just play around with it and see if it's something that's useful for your organization. Larger enterprises, I think this is a discussion that needs to be had. It is completely production ready. Let me start with that. And I've helped a number of really, really large companies do it without hesitation. It is completely enterprise ready. It just might require quite a bit of tweaking to make it suit all use cases. But larger companies with very severe data needs who are hampered by the inability to control those data streams properly, so who are hampered by the inability to control what gets sent to Facebook, what gets sent to Google. For those, this is absolutely could be a very crucial part of their next 12 months of what they're doing with data collection. So in that way, I think it's worth looking into. I still wouldn't sell it as everybody has to do it right now, but it's certainly something to look into.
Thank you so much for the detailed answer. I think there's no more questions, but I think that's why you answered your questions already in your presentation.
I know.
You are the best.
I'm helping you out. So I can just comment on the poll. I mean, that's an interesting spread. So maybe I should have left no out and just leave people for whom this is relevant. But I asked this poll actually because I'm personally being riddled with these questions. Like almost every single ad network that my clients are working with is approaching my customers with these questions or with these suggestions. And the problem is that they are rarely kind of presented in a privacy first light, let me put it like that. So they're always presented in a way that data is being taken away from us. iOS 14.5 is killing our attribution, and intelligent tracking prevention is killing our attribution. Third-party cookies are killing our attribution. So it becomes more of a how do we get our data back? And that, in my opinion, is a very dangerous and a very risky approach in today's climate, where you have to be very careful about what you collect. But if you have a legal purpose and a legal basis to collect that data, then server-side tagging will certainly help you and will be a very useful tool for that.
Yeah, and the key point is actually the legal part, I guess.
Yeah, that's always, and I think people are, I'm saying this honestly, that when GDPR and especially when e-privacy started to gain traction, it was easy to say that, okay, GDPR sounds really scary, but no one's getting the fines except the big ones. Amazon is getting the fines, and Facebook is getting the fines, and Google is getting the fines. But there are obviously that's a very poor way to look at the law, only from, do we have a chance of doing this without being fined? That's obviously a very bad ethical approach. But the other thing is that there are now organizations in the European Union, for example, whose only purpose is to identify websites which are infracting or which are in violation of these principles, and then kind of contacting the DPAs of those countries and then even the EU courts of justice on behalf of consumers. So it's not about, if you have a company, you're worried, will my customers find out that I'm collecting data without consent? Because your customers typically don't have those skills. But there are organizations whose only job is to find these sites, and they will, if you're even a blip on the map, they will at some point find you, and then you'll be in trouble. So the legal part is just super, super important to figure out. And while server-side tagging itself doesn't, like I said, it has no impact on the legal side of things, it certainly does require more deliberation from a legal point of view. The risk assessment discussion you need to have is very different from the one you'd need to have if it was just like a regular tagging setup, for example.
Thank you so much. Actually, we have still 3 minutes, and if you wanna check the last questions, it will be
sure.
Perfect. I can read them. Fabrice, what about 100% back-end tracking without Google?
So assuming you mean that collecting the data to your own data warehouses and not sending it to Google, I mean, that's just solid. That's just good practice in general. Like that's been if your company has the resources, that's the path to take for analytics, using tools like Snowplow Analytics or other kind of homebrew things that run on your own servers. That's an absolutely wise thing to do regardless. But at some point, you might notice that you want your Google Ads in integrations, you want your double-click integrations, you want your demographic data, you want to externalize data processing to Google, you want your tried and true analytics setups to work, you want your data studio connections to work fluent, and so on. At that point, you'll just need Google. I mean, that's the vendor lock we've been living in for the last 16 years. And even companies that have their own homebrew analytics in place, they typically also have Google, or also have Amplitude, or also have Mixpanel or something else. So, if you have the brawn to do it, then just going first party, 100% first party is a great idea. But you will notice soon, you'll have to educate all your users to use that instead of Google Analytics. It will be more difficult to recruit people. You'll have to maintain your own documentation, your own versioning. So it just gets very messy. So, and again, I mean, sending the data to Google isn't the problem. The problem is what you send to Google. But having Google as the data processor isn't necessarily the problem if you have the legal basis to do so. But yeah, that's an interesting thought experiment regardless.
Okay, thank you so much. I think it's our time right now. Thank you for being here with us today. It was amazing, and I hope to see you in person in the future.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. Yeah, hopefully one day we'll be able to travel and get out of this cabin fever that we've been in for the last 2 years. So hope to see you soon. Have a great day, everyone. Have a great event, the second day of the event for everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.